Dragons, fire-breathing, gold-hoarding, sky-darkening monsters of legend. Every culture on Earth has them. Medieval Europe feared them. Ancient China revered them. The Vikings carved them into their ships. Mesoamerican civilizations built entire religions around feathered serpents. But here's what no one tells you. Dragons aren't fantasy, they're memory, distorted, exaggerated, twisted through centuries of retelling, but rooted in something devastatingly real. The bones that inspired terror weren't mythical, they were massive, undeniable, and everywhere. The serpents that haunted ancient nightmares weren't imaginary, they were apex predators that actually existed alongside early humans. And the fire? Well, we'll get to that. Tonight, we're stripping away the fantasy. We're traveling back through millennia to uncover what our ancestors actually saw, what they feared, and how those encounters became the dragon myths that still captivate us today. From fossilized titans that ancient civilizations stumbled upon, to living reptilian nightmares that hunted in prehistoric forests, to the peculiar biology that might explain fire breathing itself. This is the real story behind dragons, not the Hollywood version, not the romanticized medieval tale, the gritty, fascinating, surprisingly plausible truth. So go ahead and settle in, dim those lights, maybe turn on some soft background noise if that helps you unwind. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. And if you appreciate deep dives into history's most enduring mysteries, crafted specifically to ease your mind into rest, hit that subscribe button. Subscribe to continue exploring the enigmatic corners of history that make the perfect companions for sleep. Let's begin with the bones, the enormous, terrifying bones. Chapter 1. When farmers found monsters. Imagine you're a farmer in ancient Greece around 500 BCE. You're working your land on the island of Samos, clearing stones from a field when your plow strikes something hard. You dig deeper. What emerges isn't a boulder, it's a skull. Massive, elongated, with eye sockets the size of dinner plates. The jaw alone is longer than your leg. You've never seen anything like it. No living creature you know possesses bones of this scale. Your hands tremble as you unearth more. Ribs that curve like the beams of a great hall. A femur thicker than an ancient oak. Vertebrae stacked like millstones. What would you think? What would anyone think? Without the framework of paleontology, without the concept of extinction, without the understanding that Earth's history stretches back millions of years before human memory. You'd think monster, you'd think dragon. This wasn't hypothetical. It happened repeatedly all across the ancient world. The Mediterranean region, where so many foundational dragon myths originated, is absolutely littered with fossils. The islands of Greece and the coastlines of Turkey sit atop geological formations rich in Miocene-era megafauna. Massive mammoths, enormous rhinoceroses, giant prehistoric elephants called Deinotheres, their bones weathered out of hillsides, eroded from cliffsides, emerged from caves. And ancient peoples found them, tried to make sense of them, and created monsters. The Greek historian Adrian Mayer spent decades researching this phenomenon, documenting case after case of fossil discoveries that directly correspond to specific monster myths. The giant bones found on Samos were attributed to the Needs, monstrous beings from Greek legend. Similar discoveries in Phrygia in modern-day Turkey were linked to mythical creatures that supposedly inhabited those regions. The pattern is undeniable. Where fossils emerge, dragon stories follow. Consider the griffin, that legendary creature with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle, said to guard golden treasures in the mountains of Scythia, the region north of the Black Sea. Ancient Greek and Roman writers described these creatures in detail, often reporting them as genuine animals. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, wrote about them in the 5th century BCE. Pliny the Elder included them in his natural history. They were treated as real, dangerous, exotic fauna from distant lands. Now consider this: the gold-rich regions of Scythia, particularly the areas around the Gobi Desert and Mongolia, are paleontological treasure troves. The rocks there contain abundant fossils of Protoceratops, a dinosaur from the Cretaceous period about 75 million years ago. Protoceratops was roughly the size of a large dog or small pony. It possessed a prominent beaked skull, 4 legs positioned in a sprawling stance, and most distinctively, a large bony frill extending from the back of its skull. The skeletal structure, when first encountered weathering out of desert sandstone, bears an eerie resemblance to the griffin as described in ancient texts. The beak-like jaw could be interpreted as raptor-like. The frill might suggest wings or a mane. The size is consistent, the location is exact. The ancient gold miners and nomadic peoples working and traveling through these regions would have encountered these fossils regularly. Without any understanding of deep time or extinction, they would have interpreted them as the remains of strange, dangerous creatures, perhaps creatures still living in remote mountain regions, perhaps creatures guarding the very gold deposits where their bones appeared. The myth writes itself. The same pattern emerges worldwide. In China, the oracle bones used for divination during the Shang dynasty, dating back over 3,000 years, contain references to dragon bones, not metaphorical dragons, actual bones identified as dragon remains. For millennia, Chinese traditional medicine has incorporated so-called dragon bones, prescribing them for various ailments. These weren't symbolic. Apothecaries sold actual fossils, ground into powder or used whole. Modern analysis of these traditional dragon bones reveals them to be genuine dinosaur and other prehistoric animal fossils. The connection between Chinese dragon mythology and fossil discoveries isn't speculative, it's documented in their own medicinal and religious texts. The Chinese relationship with dragons differs markedly from the Western tradition. Chinese dragons weren't typically evil monsters to be slain. They were powerful, often benevolent beings associated with water, weather, and imperial authority. They were serpentine, usually without wings, undulating through sky and sea. This imagery aligns remarkably well with the fossils most commonly found in China. The region is rich in marine reptile fossils, particularly long-necked plesiosaurs and mosasaurs from the Mesozoic era. Picture a massive serpentine skeleton, perhaps 20 or 30 feet long, emerging from a riverbank or eroding from a hillside. The vertebrae form an undulating chain. The skull is elongated, filled with sharp teeth. The ribs sweep outward. Without the context of paleontology, this is clearly a dragon, a water dragon, a creature of rivers and seas. The reverence rather than fear in Chinese dragon mythology might stem from the context in which these fossils were found. Marine fossils often emerge near water sources critical to agricultural civilizations. Finding dragon bones near life-giving rivers could easily be interpreted as these powerful beings blessing the waters. The dragons brought rain, they controlled floods, they were associated with the emperor himself, the link between heaven and earth. This mythology makes perfect sense when you understand it emerged from people encountering enormous serpentine skeletons near the water sources their entire civilization depended upon. The European experience with fossils took a darker turn. Medieval Europe was absolutely rife with dragon legends, and the physical evidence was everywhere. Mammoth skulls, cave bear remains, whale bones washed ashore, all interpreted as proof of monstrous creatures. But Europe added something else to the mix: Christianity and its cosmic battle between good and evil. Dragons became not just dangerous animals, but symbols of Satan himself, embodiments of chaos and sin that needed to be destroyed. Every saint worth his salt had to slay a dragon. Saint George, Saint Margaret, Saint Martha, the list goes on. These weren't just adventure stories, they were religious parables, and they needed physical evidence to support them. So when enormous bones were discovered, they were displayed in churches, labeled as the remains of dragons slain by holy warriors, proof of God's power over evil. The skull of a woolly mammoth with its central nasal cavity looks remarkably like a cyclops skull to the untrained eye, and medieval Europeans weren't trained in comparative anatomy. A cave bear skull, massive and elongated with prominent canines, could easily be a dragon's head. These weren't relegated to dusty corners. They were hung in cathedrals, venerated as relics, used to reinforce the mythology. Take the case of Klagenfurt, Austria, where in 1335 a massive skull was discovered in a nearby quarry. The townspeople immediately identified it as a dragon's head, and it became a source of civic pride. In 1590, they commissioned a fountain featuring a dramatic sculpture of the lindworm, their local dragon, and they modeled the dragon's head directly on the skull they'd found centuries earlier. That skull sat in the town hall for generations, proof positive that dragons had once terrorized the region. It wasn't until 1935, exactly 600 years after its discovery, that paleontologists examined it and determined it was actually the skull of a woolly rhinoceros from the Ice Age. But by then, the dragon was so embedded in local identity that it remains the symbol of Klagenfurt to this day. The fountain still stands, tourists still photograph it, and the town's coat of arms still features the lindworm, all because someone found a rhinoceros skull in 1335 and called it a dragon. This pattern repeated across Europe. The village of Mixnitz in Austria displayed dragon bones in its church for centuries, bones that turned out to be from cave bears. The Swiss city of Lucerne proudly showed off massive dragon bones that were actually mammoth remains. In Sicily, the bones of dwarf elephants, a species that lived on the island during the Pleistocene, were interpreted as dragon remains, and the skulls with their central nasal openings might have even contributed to Cyclops myths. England had its share too, with dragon legends often clustering around areas where Jurassic-era marine reptile fossils erode from coastal cliffs. The famous Lyme Regis fossil beds, where Mary Anning would later make her revolutionary discoveries in the early 1800s, sit in a region absolutely steeped in dragon lore. Coincidence? Hardly. For thousands of years before modern paleontology, people were finding these bones and incorporating them into their understanding of the world. They didn't have the framework to think extinct species from millions of years ago. They thought monster. But here's where it gets interesting. The fossils alone don't fully explain dragon mythology. Yes, they provided the physical evidence, the tangible proof that something massive and terrifying had once existed. But fossils are static. They're bones. Dragons in mythology don't just exist. They move, they hunt, they breathe fire. They interact with humans. Fossils might explain where the basic concept came from, but they don't explain the behavior, the characteristics, the specific details that make dragon myths so remarkably consistent across cultures. For that, we need to look at something else entirely. We need to look at the creatures that were actually alive when humans first started telling stories. The reptiles that our ancestors didn't just find fossilized but encountered living, breathing, and terrifying. We need to talk about what happened when early humans met the megafauna of the Pleistocene and earlier epochs, and what they might have encountered that still echoes in our collective memory. Because the truth is, our ancestors didn't need to imagine dragons. They lived alongside creatures that would absolutely fit the description if you scaled up the right reptiles or encountered them in the right circumstances. The line between myth and memory is thinner than you think. Chapter 2: The Living Nightmares. The fossils planted the seed, but living creatures watered it, nurtured it, and made it grow into something that would haunt human consciousness for millennia. Because here's the thing about dragon mythology that fossils alone can't explain: the specificity, the behaviors, the habitats, the hunting patterns, the way dragons in stories from cultures separated by thousands of miles share remarkably similar characteristics. Fossils might tell you something big and scary once existed. They don't tell you it lurked in caves, hoarded treasure, had a taste for livestock, or could be found near water. For that level of detail, you need actual encounters. You need living animals that behaved in dragon-like ways, and humanity had those encounters more than you'd think. Let's start with the most obvious candidates: the massive reptiles that absolutely did coexist with humans and absolutely did inspire terror. We're not talking about dinosaurs here. Those had been gone for 65 million years before the first humans walked the earth. We're talking about creatures that survived into the age of humans, apex predators that our ancestors would have encountered regularly, avoided desperately, and remembered vividly. First on that list, crocodilians. Modern crocodiles and alligators are impressive enough, routinely reaching 15 to 20 feet in length, equipped with bone-crushing jaws and a hunting strategy that involves lurking motionless in murky water before exploding into violence. But modern crocs are actually relatively modest compared to their recent ancestors. During the Pleistocene epoch, which only ended about 11,000 years ago, meaning humans absolutely overlapped with them, there were species that make today's crocodiles look like pets. Take Crocodilus thorbjornsoni, which lived in Africa until roughly 1.8 million years ago, and would have been encountered by early Homo erectus populations. This beast reached estimated lengths of 24 feet or more, with a skull alone measuring over 3 feet long. Or consider Quincana, a terrestrial crocodile from Australia that survived until possibly 40,000 years ago, right around the time humans first arrived on the continent. Unlike modern crocodiles that are semi-aquatic ambush predators, Quincana was built for running down prey on land. It had long legs, a deep skull filled with blade-like teeth, and it could gallop. Imagine being an early human in Australia, armed with stone, tools, and fire, watching a 20-foot reptile with a mouthful of steak knives charging at you across open ground. That's not a story you tell once around the campfire and then forget. That's a story that gets passed down for generations, embellished certainly, but rooted in genuine terror. Then there's the matter of size variation in ancient crocodilians. The saltwater crocodiles of Southeast Asia and Northern Australia, which are still around today, regularly exceed 20 feet. And there are historical accounts of specimens reaching 23 feet or more. These are modern animals, not Pleistocene megafauna. During the Pleistocene, when megafauna in general were larger, crocodilian species in these same regions were correspondingly more massive. The fossil record from places like the Philippines and Indonesia, areas with rich dragon mythology, particularly the Naga serpents of Hindu and Buddhist tradition, reveals crocodilian species that would have been truly monstrous. And these creatures weren't just big. They were smart, adaptable, and occupied precisely the ecological niches where early humans needed to be, near water sources, along riverbanks, in estuaries. Every time you went to the river to fish, to gather water, to cross to better hunting grounds, you were entering dragon territory. The behavior of crocodilians also maps remarkably well onto dragon mythology. They lurk in caves and burrows along riverbanks. They're associated with water but also emerge onto land. They're ambush predators that explode from concealment. They hoard, not treasure but food, dragging kills underwater and wedging them under logs or in underwater caves to rot before eating. And they're patient, capable of remaining motionless for hours, barely breathing, appearing almost dead before suddenly lunging into deadly action. If you were an ancient human trying to explain to your children why they should never ever go near that particular stretch of river alone, you'd describe exactly what we describe when we talk about dragons. A massive reptilian creature that lives near water, hides in caves, remains still for long periods, and then attacks with horrifying speed and power. You'd probably add some embellishments, make it bigger, give it more fearsome features, maybe even give it the ability to breathe fire. But the core description is just a large crocodilian. Now let's talk about something even more interesting, the giant monitor lizards. Today's Komodo dragon, found on a handful of Indonesian islands, is the world's largest living lizard, reaching lengths of 10 feet and weights exceeding 300 pounds. It's an apex predator with serrated teeth, venomous saliva, and a hunting strategy that combines ambush attacks with patient stalking of wounded prey. If you're bitten by a Komodo dragon and escape, you haven't really escaped. The bacteria and venom in its saliva will cause your wound to fester and your blood to refuse to clot. The dragon will track you for days, following your scent, waiting for you to weaken and collapse. Then it will find you and eat you. This isn't mythology. This is documented behavior of an animal that exists right now. But the Komodo dragon is just the remnant of a much more widespread family. Monitor lizards were found across Asia, Africa, and Australia throughout the Pleistocene, and some species were considerably larger than today's Komodo. Megalania, which lived in Australia until at least 40,000 years ago and possibly much more recently, was a monitor lizard that reached estimated lengths of 18 to 23 feet and weighed well over a ton. It was the largest terrestrial lizard ever to have existed, and it absolutely overlapped with human arrival in Australia. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have oral traditions stretching back tens of thousands of years, and many of those traditions feature enormous reptilian creatures. The rainbow serpent, one of the most important figures in Aboriginal mythology, is described as a massive serpentine being associated with water, creation, and destruction. While the rainbow serpent is a complex mythological figure with many interpretations, the basic description, massive, reptilian, both revered and feared, fits remarkably well with memories of Megalania and other megafauna encounters. The ecological niche that large monitor lizards occupy also aligns perfectly with dragon behavior in mythology. They're intelligent, far more so than crocodilians, capable of learning, problem-solving, and adapting hunting strategies. They're opportunistic feeders, which means they'll eat anything they can kill, including humans if the opportunity arises. They're often found near human settlements because human settlements attract prey animals, livestock, rodents, birds. They're associated with caves and rocky outcrops where they shelter and nest, and they have this unsettling habit of rising up on their hind legs when threatened or displaying, making themselves appear larger and more imposing. A 20-foot Megalania rearing up would stand 8 or 9 feet tall, a truly nightmarish sight. Add in the venomous bite, the festering wounds, the patient stalking behavior, and you have a creature that would generate exactly the kind of mythology that surrounds dragons, a monster that might seem dead or gone but is actually tracking you, waiting for you to weaken, a creature whose bite carries a curse that kills you slowly days after the encounter. But we're not done with living reptiles yet. We need to talk about snakes, giant snakes. Because while Western dragons tend to be portrayed as lizard-like with legs, many dragon traditions, particularly in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, emphasize the serpentine aspect. Chinese long dragons, Southeast Asian nagas, Mesoamerican feathered serpents, all are essentially giant snakes with added features. And humanity has had a long, deeply embedded, evolutionarily reinforced fear of snakes. Primates in general have specialized neural pathways for detecting snakes quickly. We're literally hardwired to spot them and react with fear before our conscious mind even processes what we're seeing. This makes sense because snakes have been killing primates for tens of millions of years. Our fear of snakes isn't cultural, it's genetic. Now, today's largest snakes, reticulated pythons and green anacondas, can reach lengths of 20 to 30 feet, though specimens that long are rare. They're constrictors, ambush predators that seize prey and squeeze until the victim's heart stops. They're perfectly capable of killing and eating humans, and they occasionally do, particularly when the humans are children or when the snake is exceptionally large. But during the Pleistocene and earlier epochs, there were snakes that make today's giants look modest. Titanoboa, which lived about 60 million years ago, reached estimated lengths of 42 feet and weighed over a ton. It was gone long before humans evolved, so it couldn't have influenced human mythology directly, but its existence proves that snakes can reach truly monstrous proportions given the right environmental conditions. More relevant to human mythology are the giant snakes that actually overlapped with human populations. Gigantophis, which lived in North Africa until relatively recently in geological terms, reached lengths of 33 feet or more. Wanambi, a massive constrictor from Australia, survived until at least 40,000 years ago and possibly later. It reached lengths of 15 to 20 feet and was an ambush predator that likely targeted the megafauna of Pleistocene Australia. When humans arrived in Australia, they would have encountered these massive serpents, and those encounters would have been memorable. Aboriginal traditions speak of enormous serpents that inhabited waterholes and rock formations, serpents that could kill with a look or a breath, serpents that demanded respect and sacrifice. These traditions are often dismissed as pure mythology, but they map remarkably well onto the actual ecology of Pleistocene Australia's megafauna, including giant constrictors. The behavior of large constrictors also explains specific aspects of dragon mythology that other reptiles don't quite cover. The idea of dragons coiling around their victims, crushing them, that's constrictor behavior. The association of serpent dragons with water and waterholes, that's where ambush hunting snakes wait for prey to come drink. The notion that dragons could swallow victims whole, which appears in many traditions, that's exactly what large snakes do once they've killed their prey. They don't chew, they dislocate their jaws and swallow meals whole, and they can consume prey much larger than seems physically possible. A 20-foot python can swallow a deer. A 30-foot anaconda has been documented swallowing caimans and even jaguars. Scale that up slightly in human imagination, add thousands of years of retelling, and you get dragons that swallow knights in armor, dragons that consume entire flocks of sheep, dragons whose bellies are graveyards of the unwary. There's also the matter of snakeskin and the way it reflects light. Scales, particularly the scales of large snakes, can be iridescent, shimmering with colors that shift as the snake moves. In certain lights, particularly dawn or dusk when humans would often encounter these animals coming to or from water sources, a large snake's scales might appear to glow or shimmer with an almost metallic quality. Add in the way snakes move, that sinuous undulation that seems almost supernatural in its fluidity, and you have a creature that seems otherworldly even before you start embellishing. It's not hard to see how a 20-foot python or anaconda, glimpsed in dim light near a river, scales catching the light, moving with that eerie serpentine grace, would be remembered as something more than just a snake, something magical, something dragon-like. Then there's the question of venom. Most large constrictors aren't venomous. They don't need to be. They kill by constriction. But some ancient snakes were both large and venomous, and even today there are venomous snakes of considerable size. King cobras can reach 18 feet and deliver enough neurotoxic venom in a single bite to kill an elephant. The inland taipan of Australia has venom so potent that a single bite contains enough toxin to kill 100 adult humans. These snakes are modern. They exist right now, and they're both large enough and dangerous enough to warrant genuine fear. In the Pleistocene, when many reptile species were larger, venomous snakes of even more impressive dimensions would have existed. The effects of snake venom, particularly neurotoxic venom, can also seem almost supernatural to people without medical knowledge. Paralysis, hallucinations, respiratory failure, hemorrhaging, all can result from venomous snake bites. A person bitten by a large venomous snake might survive long enough to make it back to their village, describe what happened, describe the symptoms they're experiencing, and then die in front of everyone. That's the kind of event that generates mythology. The snake's bite isn't just deadly, it's cursed, it's magical, it can kill you even after you've escaped. So we have crocodilians that lurk near water, explode from concealment, and drag victims into underwater caves. We have giant monitor lizards that track wounded prey for days, deliver venomous bites, and rear up to terrifying heights. We have massive constrictors that coil around victims, crush them, and swallow them whole. And we have venomous serpents whose bite delivers a curse-like poison that kills slowly and agonizingly. Every single one of these creatures existed. Every single one was encountered by early humans. Every single one would have generated stories, warnings, traditions, and every single one maps onto specific aspects of dragon mythology that appear across cultures. The dragons weren't imagined from nothing. They were remembered, distilled from genuine encounters with apex predator reptiles that our ancestors lived alongside and feared for very good reasons. The mythology didn't create the fear. The creatures created the fear, and the mythology preserved it. Chapter 3. The Fire in Their Breath. Now we come to the part that seems purely fantastical, the fire breathing, because everything we've discussed so far, the massive bones, the living reptilian predators, all of that is grounded in observable reality. Ancient peoples found fossils and misinterpreted them. Early humans encountered enormous crocodiles, monitor lizards, and snakes that absolutely warranted the terror that became encoded in dragon myths. But fire breathing? That seems like pure imagination, the one element of dragon mythology that crosses the line from distorted memory into outright fantasy. Except, and this is where things get genuinely fascinating, it might not be fantasy at all. At least, not entirely. Because when you dig into the natural world, when you examine the truly bizarre capabilities that evolution has produced, you start to realize that fire breathing, or something functionally similar, isn't as impossible as it seems. Let's start with the most obvious parallel, the bombardier beetle. This small insect, found on every continent except Antarctica, has evolved one of the most remarkable defensive mechanisms in nature. When threatened, it mixes two chemicals, hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide, stored in separate chambers in its abdomen. These chemicals are combined in a reaction chamber with catalytic enzymes, and the resulting reaction is explosive, literally. The mixture heats to 100 degrees Celsius. That's 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the boiling point of water, and is expelled from the beetle's abdomen with an audible pop. The spray is toxic, burning, and can be aimed with surprising accuracy using the beetle's articulated abdomen. The beetle essentially has a chemical weapon system built into its body, a system that produces heat, toxic spray, and an explosion, all from stored chemicals and biological catalysts. If a beetle the size of your fingernail can evolve chemical warfare that involves explosive heat generation, is it really so impossible that a much larger animal could evolve something similar? The bombardier beetle isn't alone in its chemical capabilities. There are entire families of insects and arthropods that produce defensive chemicals, some caustic, some toxic, some foul-smelling enough to deter predators. Millipedes secrete cyanide compounds. Certain ants spray formic acid. Skunks, though not insects, famously produce thiols that can be sprayed with remarkable accuracy and create a stench so overwhelming it's effectively a weapon. Nature has repeatedly demonstrated that animals can evolve glands capable of producing, storing, and expelling chemical compounds for defense or hunting. The chemistry involved is complex, requiring specialized cellular machinery, but it's absolutely within the realm of biological possibility. Evolution has produced it multiple times in different lineages. The question isn't whether animals can produce and weaponize chemicals. The question is whether any animal could produce chemicals capable of combustion and whether such a capability could exist in a large reptile. Now let's be clear, no known animal actually breathes fire in the sense of projecting flames from its mouth, but several animals do produce, expel, or utilize chemicals, heat, or electrical discharges in ways that, to an observer without modern scientific knowledge, might appear supernatural or dragon-like. Take the spitting cobra, which can spray venom from its fangs with remarkable accuracy, up to distances of 6 feet or more. The venom is aimed at the eyes of threats, causing immediate pain and temporary or permanent blindness. To a person on the receiving end, it would feel like being struck by liquid fire, burning, blinding agony. The cobra doesn't breathe fire, obviously, but it projects a burning substance from its head toward its enemies. The parallel to fire-breathing dragons isn't perfect, but it's not nothing either. Imagine a much larger reptile with a similar capability, one that could spray a caustic, burning substance 10 or 20 feet. You'd describe that as breathing fire, wouldn't you? Or at least breathing something that burns like fire. Then there's the matter of chemical production in reptiles more generally. Many snakes, lizards, and other reptiles produce complex venoms, toxins, and chemical secretions. The Gila monster and Mexican beaded lizard produce venoms that cause excruciating pain, swelling, and in severe cases, respiratory failure. Some species of frogs secrete toxins so potent they've been used by indigenous peoples to poison arrows. The poison dart frogs of Central and South America produce alkaloid toxins in their skin that can cause paralysis and death in predators. Nature has repeatedly demonstrated that animals can synthesize incredibly complex and dangerous chemicals within their bodies. The question isn't whether an animal could produce chemicals, it's whether those chemicals could be made flammable or heat-producing and expelled in a controlled manner. And here's where things get speculative but not impossible. phosphorus compounds. White phosphorus ignites spontaneously when exposed to air, burning at extremely high temperatures and producing dense white smoke. It's one of the most reactive elements that exists in stable form at normal temperatures. If an animal could somehow synthesize and store phosphorus compounds in an oxygen-free environment, perhaps in a specialized gland or sac, then expel them through a specialized duct where they'd be exposed to air, you'd get fire. Real, actual fire. Is there any animal that does this? No. But is it biologically impossible? Also no. Evolution has produced far stranger things. The biochemistry would be incredibly complex, requiring mechanisms to synthesize phosphorus compounds, store them safely, and expel them in a controlled manner that doesn't harm the animal itself. But complex biochemistry is what evolution does best. Given sufficient evolutionary pressure, given enough time, given the right environmental circumstances, fire breathing isn't beyond the realm of biological possibility. Consider the electric eel, which can generate electrical discharges of up to 860 volts, enough to stun a horse or kill a human. It does this using specialized cells called electrocytes, essentially biological batteries that have evolved to produce, store, and discharge electrical energy. The eel uses this both for navigation in murky water and for hunting and defense. If evolution can produce a living battery capable of generating lethal electrical shocks, why couldn't it produce a living flamethrower? The mechanisms would be different, certainly, chemical rather than electrical, but the principle is the same, a specialized organ system that produces and weaponizes energy. The evolutionary pressure would need to be there. Fire breathing would need to provide significant survival or reproductive advantages, but the basic biological toolkit necessary for chemical weapon systems absolutely exists in nature. It's not a question of whether such capabilities are possible in principle. It's a question of whether they actually evolved in any of the large reptiles that inspired dragon mythology. Now let's pivot to something even more interesting. The possibility that early humans encountered animals that appeared to breathe fire even if they didn't actually produce flames. There are several scenarios that could create this illusion, and some of them are surprisingly plausible. First, consider animals that inhabit volcanic regions. In areas with volcanic activity, there are natural gas vents, sulfurous emissions, and areas where the ground itself can ignite methane or other flammable gases seeping from underground. Volcanic regions often have fumaroles, vents that emit hot gases and steam at temperatures that can exceed 100 degrees Celsius. If a large reptile, say a monitor lizard or a crocodilian, made its lair near such a vent, it could appear to be associated with fire. The area around its cave might smell of sulfur, that distinctive rotten egg odor that ancient peoples associated with demons and hell. There might be visible flames or smoke from natural gas vents. The ground might be hot to the touch. The rocks might be scorched and blackened from exposure to volcanic gases. An early human encountering such a creature would have no framework for understanding volcanic geology. They wouldn't know about tectonic plates or magma chambers or gas emissions. They'd see a large, dangerous reptile living in a place where fire emerges from the earth, where the air itself seems to burn, where the ground is too hot to walk on barefoot, and they'd make the obvious connection. The creature commands fire. The creature is associated with fire. Perhaps the creature produces fire. The mythology writes itself not from fabrication but from observation combined with misunderstanding. The dragon breathes fire because it lives in a place where fire exists. And without knowledge of volcanic processes, the only explanation is that the fire comes from the creature itself. This isn't just speculation. There are specific dragon legends that align perfectly with volcanic geography. The dragons of Iceland's sagas, for instance, often inhabit volcanic caves and are described as being surrounded by heat and sulfurous fumes. Iceland is one of the most volcanically active places on Earth, sitting atop the mid-Atlantic ridge where tectonic plates are actively pulling apart. The island is dotted with volcanoes, hot springs, geysers, fumaroles, and lava fields. The association between dragons and volcanic features in Icelandic mythology isn't mysterious, it's observational. People saw large animals, possibly walruses or seals, which were unfamiliar and frightening to early settlers near volcanic features, and the two became linked in mythology. The dragons of Iceland breathe fire because Iceland itself breathes fire, and anything living in such an environment would naturally be associated with that fire. The Polynesians have traditions of fire goddesses and dragon-like beings associated with volcanoes, most famously Pele in Hawaiian mythology. While Pele is a goddess rather than a dragon per se, the motifs are similar, a powerful, dangerous being that dwells in volcanic regions and commands fire. These traditions emerge directly from living on volcanic islands where the earth itself produces fire and smoke. If you add in the presence of large reptiles, which many Pacific islands had before human arrival, the connection becomes even clearer. The volcanic activity provides the fire element. The reptilian megafauna provides the physical form. Combined, they create the dragon, a fire-breathing reptilian monster that embodies the very real dangers of living in a geologically active region. The mythology isn't fantasy. It's an attempt to explain and cope with genuine environmental hazards using the conceptual framework available to the culture. There's also the matter of bioluminescence and the way certain animals can appear to glow. While bioluminescence is more common in marine environments, there are terrestrial organisms that produce light, certain fungi, insects like fireflies, even some millipedes. If a large reptile happened to consume bioluminescent organisms, or if bacteria in its mouth or throat happened to be bioluminescent, it could appear to have a glowing mouth or throat, especially in low light conditions. This might sound far-fetched, but consider the Komodo dragon again. Its saliva is teeming with bacteria, over 50 different bacterial strains, many of them potentially bioluminescent in the right conditions. The inside of a Komodo dragon's mouth is essentially a bacterial ecosystem, a soup of microorganisms that aid in the festering of wounds inflicted on prey. Some of these bacteria produce light as a metabolic byproduct under certain conditions, particularly in oxygen-poor environments. A Komodo dragon's mouth at night, particularly if the animal had recently fed and the bacterial populations were actively breaking down organic matter, might produce a faint glow. It wouldn't be bright, but in complete darkness, away from artificial light, even a faint bioluminescent glow would be visible and deeply unsettling. To an early human observer, a large reptile with a glowing mouth emerging from a dark cave would be absolutely terrifying, and would certainly be remembered as something supernatural, something that had inner fire. The mythology emerges organically from misunderstanding natural phenomena. The dragon doesn't actually breathe fire, but its mouth glows with an eerie light that could easily be interpreted as fire, especially when combined with the cultural expectation that powerful, dangerous creatures should have fire-like qualities. Then there's the possibility of misinterpreted behavior. Many reptiles, particularly when basking in sunlight after being cold, will open their mouths wide to regulate body temperature. This behavior is called gaping, and it's extremely common in crocodilians. Crocodiles will lie on riverbanks with their jaws agape for hours, allowing evaporative cooling from the mouth and throat to regulate their body temperature. The inside of a crocodile's mouth, the soft pink and red tissues of the throat, the white teeth, the fleshy tongue, all of this becomes visible when they gape. In bright sunlight, particularly at dawn or dusk when the light is red, orange and low angle, the inside of that mouth could appear to be glowing, almost as if there were fire within. The red tissues catch the red light. The contrast between the dark exterior of the animal and the bright interior of the mouth creates the illusion of internal illumination. Add in the fact that crocodiles often bask near water, and when they exhale or hiss, visible water vapor might emerge from their mouths, especially in cooler weather or during morning hours, when the temperature differential between the animal's warm breath and cool air is greatest. Water vapor from a warm mouth in cool air looks like smoke. It's the same principle that makes your breath visible on cold winter mornings. A basking crocodile with its mouth open, throat tissues glowing red in dawn light, exhaling visible vapor, would look remarkably like a creature with fire in its throat. It's not fire breathing, but it could easily be mistaken for it, especially if the observer is already terrified and viewing the creature from a distance. The mythology preserves the observation. There's something fire-like about this creature's mouth and breath, while completely misunderstanding the mechanism. Speaking of hissing, let's talk about the sounds that large reptiles make and how these sounds might contribute to fire-breathing mythology. Crocodilians, when threatened or displaying, produce deep, resonant bellows and hisses that carry for considerable distances. These sounds are not just loud, but felt, low-frequency vibrations that can be sensed in your chest and bones before you even consciously hear them. The sound of a large crocodile bellowing is genuinely primordial, something that triggers deep fear responses in humans, because it's a sound our ancestors would have learned to associate with danger. Monitor lizards produce loud hissing sounds by expelling air from their lungs, and the hiss can be accompanied by visible water vapor or even mucus from the respiratory tract. Snakes, of course, are famous for hissing, and large constrictors produce hisses that sound remarkably like steam escaping under pressure. A high-pitched, continuous sound that's both audible and unsettling. If you're an early human encountering one of these creatures, the combination of the sound, the visible vapor, any heat shimmer from a large reptile's body on a hot day, and your own terror-induced adrenaline could easily create the impression that the creature is breathing fire, or at least breathing something hot, toxic, and dangerous. The sound itself suggests heat and pressure, like water boiling or metal being heated. The visible vapor suggests smoke or steam. The sheer, intimidating nature of the display suggests supernatural power. You'd tell people the creature breathed fire because that's genuinely what it seemed like in the moment. Your senses and your cultural framework for understanding danger combined to create an interpretation that felt true even if it wasn't literally accurate. The mythology wouldn't be a lie. It would be a sincere attempt to describe an experience that exceeded your ability to explain it rationally with the knowledge available to you. There's also a more symbolic interpretation worth considering, one that doesn't require any actual fire or fire-like phenomena, but instead recognizes fire as metaphor. Fire, in virtually every human culture, represents danger, destruction, purification, and transformation. It's one of the most primal fears and one of the most essential tools. Early humans' relationship with fire was complex. They needed it for warmth, cooking, protection from predators, for social cohesion. Gathering around the fire was how early human groups bonded and shared information. Yet fire could also destroy everything they had in moments if it got out of control. Wildfires could consume entire landscapes. A single spark in a thatched dwelling could kill a family. Fire was power, the ultimate power in many ways. The difference between survival and death, between safety and catastrophe. So when humans encountered apex predators, creatures that represented existential danger, it makes sense that they'd associate those creatures with fire. The dragon breathes fire not necessarily because it literally does, but because fire is the symbolic representation of ultimate danger. The dragon is as dangerous as fire, as destructive as fire, as powerful as fire, as uncontrollable as fire. Therefore, the dragon has fire, the dragon is fire, the dragon breathes fire. The mythology encodes the emotional truth of the encounter, even if it's not literally accurate. When you face a 20-foot crocodile exploding from the water, when you encounter a massive monitor lizard rearing up on its hind legs, when you stumble upon a giant constrictor coiled near a waterhole, the terror you feel is burning, consuming, transformative. Describing that terror as fire makes perfect sense. The creature doesn't need to literally breathe flames for the fire-breathing mythology to feel true to the people creating it. But let's push this even further into speculative territory while staying within the realm of biological possibility. What if there were Pleistocene megafauna reptiles that did have some form of chemical defense system similar to the bombardier beetle but scaled up? What if there were species of large monitor lizards or crocodilians that could spray caustic or heat-producing chemicals as a defensive mechanism? Such species would have left no direct fossil evidence because soft tissues, glands, and chemical-producing organs don't fossilize. We know these creatures existed from their bones. We know their size and basic body structure, but we have almost no information about their soft tissue anatomy, their glandular systems, their physiological capabilities beyond what we can infer from modern relatives and biomechanics. It's entirely possible that some Pleistocene megafauna reptiles had capabilities that would seem dragon-like, capabilities that modern species have lost or never had. Evolution is full of dead ends, traits that appeared, provided advantages for a time, and then disappeared as environments changed or as the species possessing them went extinct. If megalania could spray a caustic chemical that produced heat when it contacted air or organic tissue, we'd have no way of knowing from the fossil record. The bones would look the same, but humans who encountered it would know. They'd remember being sprayed with liquid that burned skin, that produced visible heat or steam, that caused pain unlike anything else they'd experienced. They'd tell stories about giant lizards that could burn you without touching you, that breathed fire or something fire-like. The stories would persist even after the last megalania died, passed down through generations, embellished certainly, but rooted in genuine encounters with a creature that had capabilities we can't detect from fossils alone. Consider also the possibility of symbiotic relationships. There are examples throughout nature of animals that use other organisms to produce chemicals or capabilities they can't produce themselves. Certain sea slugs sequester toxins from the organisms they eat and repurpose those toxins for their own defense. Some birds acquire toxins from their diet and concentrate those toxins in their feathers to deter predators. Poison dart frogs don't actually produce their own toxins, they acquire them from the ants and mites they consume, and when raised in captivity on a different diet, they're not poisonous at all. If a large reptile consumed organisms that produced flammable or heat-generating compounds, and if that reptile had evolved a way to store those compounds and expel them, you'd have a creature that could effectively breathe fire using chemistry borrowed from its diet. This isn't how modern reptiles work, but it's not biologically impossible. Evolution has produced stranger relationships. There's also the matter of methane production. Many animals produce methane as a byproduct of digestion, particularly herbivores with complex gut bacteria that break down cellulose. Cows are famous for producing methane, enough that their collective emissions are a meaningful contributor to greenhouse gases. Termites also produce significant methane. The methane is typically expelled through normal digestive processes, but imagine a reptile that had evolved a way to store methane in a specialized chamber and expel it in controlled amounts. Methane is flammable. It burns readily when ignited. If such a reptile expelled methane, and if there were any source of ignition, perhaps chemical, perhaps bacterial, perhaps from consuming fire in volcanic regions and maintaining live embers in specially adapted tissues, you'd get flames, real flames, expelled from the creature's mouth or specialized ducts. Is this likely? No. Is it possible? Within the bounds of biochemistry and evolutionary adaptation, yes. The point is this: fire-breathing dragons in the literal sense probably never existed, but the possibility isn't as fantastical as it seems at first glance. Nature has produced chemical weapon systems, electrical weapons, biological light production, symbiotic relationships that enable capabilities an organism couldn't produce alone, all within the reptilian lineages. The biochemistry necessary for fire breathing or something functionally similar exists in the natural world, just not combined in the specific way that would produce the classical dragon. But creatures that could appear to breathe fire, creatures associated with fire, creatures that produced heat or caustic sprays or lived in volcanic regions or had glowing mouths or whose hissing exhalations looked like smoke, those creatures absolutely could have existed. And those encounters, combined with the human tendency to use fire as a metaphor for danger and power, would be more than sufficient to encode fire breathing into dragon mythology across cultures. The fire isn't the fantasy. The fire is the symbol, the encapsulation of genuine fear translated into mythological language. Our ancestors weren't making things up. They were trying to communicate the terror of their encounters with apex predators using the most powerful imagery available to them, and nothing communicates danger quite like fire. Whether the fire was literal, metaphorical, misinterpreted natural phenomena, or some combination of all three, the mythology encodes something real, the experience of encountering creatures so dangerous, so powerful, so beyond normal human capacity to control, that they seemed to embody fire itself. The dragons breathed fire because fire is what danger looks like, feels like, burns like, consumes like. And the creatures that inspired dragon myths were dangerous enough to warrant that association, whether or not they could actually produce flames. Chapter 4: The Dragon Slayers and What They Really Killed. So we've established that dragons, in essence, were real. The bones existed, the living creatures existed, the terror was justified. But there's another layer to dragon mythology that needs examining, the part where humans fight back. Because dragon legends aren't just about monsters existing, they're about monsters being confronted, battled, and ultimately slain. Every culture with dragon myths has dragon slayers, heroes who face these terrors and emerged victorious. St. George and his dragon, Beowulf and his dragon, Sigurd and Fafnir, the Chinese hero Liu Bang, the Japanese god Susanoo, on and on. These stories follow remarkably similar patterns. The hero confronts the dragon, often to save a community or win a treasure, employs some combination of strength, cunning, and divine favor, and ultimately kills the beast. But here's the question that should nag at you. If dragons were based on real creatures, were the dragon slayers also real? And if so, what were they actually killing? Let's start with the most obvious possibility. They were killing large, dangerous animals that threatened human communities. This isn't speculation. This is documented history. Humans have been hunting and killing megafauna predators since we first developed the cognitive ability and technology to do so. We hunted mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, cave bears, all to extinction or near extinction. We've done the same with large predators that threatened livestock or settlements, wolves, bears, big cats, systematically eliminating them from regions where humans wanted to live safely. The idea that humans would hunt and kill large, dangerous reptiles isn't far-fetched, it's inevitable. If a 20-foot crocodile is taking your children when they go to the river, if a massive monitor lizard is raiding your livestock, if a giant constrictor has made its lair near your village's only water source, you don't just accept that. You organize a hunting party. You kill the creature. And then you celebrate that kill, commemorate it, turn it into a story that will be told and retold until it becomes legend. The practical reality of hunting large reptiles also explains many specific details in dragon-slaying myths. Dragons in stories often have weak spots, places where they can be wounded or killed. Sigurd slays Fafnir by hiding in a pit and stabbing upward into the dragon's belly as it crawls over him. This makes perfect sense as a hunting strategy for large reptiles. Crocodiles, monitor lizards, and snakes all have relatively vulnerable underbellies compared to their heavily scaled or armored backs. If you're hunting a large crocodile, you don't attack it head-on where its jaws and armored hide provide maximum protection. You wait for it to pass, or you approach from below in the water and you strike at the softer ventral surface. The mythology preserves actual hunting knowledge disguised as heroic legend. St. George's lance finding the one spot where his sword could penetrate the dragon's scales. That's not magical. That's a hunter knowing anatomy, knowing where the ribs are thinner, where the scales are less dense, where a spear thrust will reach vital organs. Dragons in mythology also frequently retreat to lairs, caves, or water when wounded, and that's exactly what large reptiles do. A wounded crocodile will immediately make for deep water where it has the advantage. A monitor lizard will retreat to its burrow or a rock crevice where it can defend a narrow entrance. Snakes, when injured, will seek shelter in holes, under logs, anywhere they can protect themselves while recovering. The dragon-slaying heroes who track wounded dragons to their lairs and finish them off aren't engaging in fantasy. They're engaging in the patient, dangerous work of hunting a wounded apex predator that's now even more dangerous because it's cornered and desperate. This is the reality of hunting large, dangerous animals. You don't usually kill them with the first blow. You wound them, track them, and eventually corner them. Every big game hunter throughout history has understood this, and the dragon myths reflect that understanding. There's also the matter of weapons and tactics. Dragon-slaying legends often involve specific weapons, famous swords with names, enchanted spears, special armor. But strip away the mythological embellishment and you're left with something much more practical, specialized hunting equipment. If you're going to hunt a massive reptile, you need weapons suited to the task. You need reach, so you use spears or lances rather than swords. You need penetrating power, so you use narrow-pointed weapons that can slip between scales rather than broad-bladed weapons designed for slashing. You need protection, so you use shields and the heaviest armor available because one bite or tail strike from a large crocodilian or monitor lizard can shatter bones or worse. The famous dragon-slaying weapons weren't magical, they were effective. They were the right tools for an incredibly dangerous job, and they became famous because they worked and because the men who wielded them survived to tell about it. The communal aspect of dragon slaying also rings true when viewed through this lens. While mythology often focuses on a single hero, many dragon-slaying tales mention companions, helpers, or entire communities participating in the hunt. Beowulf brings warriors with him to face the dragon, though they ultimately flee. Chinese dragon-slaying myths often involve imperial armies or groups of heroes rather than individuals. This reflects the reality of hunting megafauna. You don't hunt a 20-foot crocodile alone if you want to survive. You organize. You bring multiple hunters with multiple weapons. You coordinate tactics. Someone drives the creature from its lair while others wait with spears. Someone distracts it while others attack from the flanks. This is how humans have always hunted dangerous animals too large and powerful to face individually. And the dragon myths preserve that tradition even as they elevate specific individuals to heroic status. Now let's talk about motivation. Why would you hunt a dragon? The myths usually give us two answers: to protect the community or to gain treasure. And both of these map perfectly onto the reality of hunting dangerous megafauna. Protecting the community is obvious. If a large predator is threatening humans or livestock, it needs to be eliminated. This is pest control on a massive, dangerous scale, but it's fundamentally the same activity that humans engage in whenever we decide a particular animal has become incompatible with human habitation. We still do this today with problem bears, rogue elephants, man-eating tigers, or crocodiles. The difference is we now have rifles and professional wildlife managers. Early humans had spears and communal hunting parties, but the impulse and the necessity were identical. The dragon had to die so the community could live safely, and whoever killed it would be celebrated, honored, and remembered. The treasure angle is more interesting and more complex. Dragons in mythology hoard treasure, gold, jewels, precious objects. They guard it jealously and kill anyone who tries to take it. But why would a dragon, an animal, care about gold? It can't eat gold. It can't use gold. The standard explanation is that dragons are inherently greedy, that they love treasure for its own sake. But that's a human characteristic being projected onto an animal. Real animals don't care about gold, but humans do, desperately. And this is where the mythology reveals something fascinating about itself. The treasure isn't the dragon's motivation, it's the human motivation. The dragon has treasure not because dragons naturally hoard wealth, but because that's the only reason beyond immediate survival necessity that would justify the enormous risk of hunting such a creature. You need a reward proportional to the danger. Here's what actually happened. Humans found valuable things in places where dangerous animals lived. Gold in caves that were lairs for bears or crocodiles. Gems in riverbeds inhabited by dangerous reptiles. Valuable trade routes through territories where large predators hunted. The real treasure was access to resources, and the dragon, the dangerous animal, was the obstacle preventing that access. Kill the dragon, gain the treasure, not because the dragon was hoarding it, but because the dragon was in the way. The mythology reverses the causation. It says the dragon hoards treasure, therefore we must kill it, when the reality was we want access to this place, therefore we must kill the creature that lives there. But the end result is the same: dead dragon, valuable resources now available to humans, and a hero celebrated for making that happen. This also explains why dragon hoards in mythology contain such specific things: crowns, rings, swords, armor, worked gold and silver. These aren't things a dragon would collect. They're things humans would have hidden or lost. Imagine a chief or king fleeing an invasion, seeking refuge in a remote cave, bringing his tribe's wealth with him. He dies there, or he's killed. or he simply never returns. Years later, the cave has become a lair for a large predator, a bear, a crocodile, whatever. Someone eventually discovers this, tries to explore the cave for shelter or resources, encounters the dangerous animal, barely escapes or doesn't escape at all. The story spreads. There's treasure in that cave, but there's also a monster guarding it. The monster doesn't care about the treasure, it's just a predator living in a cave that happens to contain human artifacts. But from a human perspective, the monster is guarding the treasure, preventing access to it, hoarding it. The mythology emerges organically from misunderstanding animal behavior and human fear. There's also a more grim possibility worth considering. Some of the treasure in dragon hoards might have been the possessions of the dragon's victims. If a large crocodile drags someone into its lair and consumes them, anything that person was carrying, metal objects, jewelry, weapons, remains in the lair. Over time, over multiple victims, this accumulates. The lair becomes a charnel house, bones and possessions of everyone the creature has killed. When someone finally succeeds in killing the creature and exploring its lair, they find this accumulation and interpret it as hoarding behavior. The dragon was collecting treasure, they think, when really the dragon was just killing people who happened to have possessions. The mythology preserves the observation there's valuable stuff in the monster's lair, while completely misunderstanding the mechanism by which it got there. Now let's address the elephant in the room. If humans were successfully killing these creatures, why did they go extinct? Because many of the megafauna reptiles we've discussed are indeed extinct. Megalania is gone. Quincana is gone. The giant constrictors of Pleistocene Australia are gone. Even populations of more modest reptiles like large crocodilians have been drastically reduced in historical times. The answer is us, humans. We killed them, and we killed them so effectively that they ceased to exist. This is the dark underside of the dragon slayer mythology. The heroes who killed dragons weren't just protecting communities, they were participating in extinctions. We didn't just hunt the occasional problem animal, we hunted them systematically, eliminated them from region after region, pushed them to smaller and smaller refuges, and eventually killed the last ones. The dragon slayers won, completely and totally, and the result is that dragons disappeared from the world. This pattern is visible throughout human history. Wherever humans arrive in a new region, megafauna extinctions follow within a few thousand years. Australia lost its megafauna, including megalania and giant constrictors, shortly after human arrival 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. The Americas lost mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and numerous other megafauna species within a few thousand years of human arrival around 15,000 years ago. Madagascar lost giant lemurs, elephant birds, and other unique fauna after human colonization around 2,000 years ago. The pattern is undeniable, and the mechanism is clear. Humans are exceptionally efficient at hunting large animals to extinction, either directly through hunting or indirectly through habitat destruction and competition. The creatures that inspired dragon myths followed the same trajectory. We feared them, hunted them, celebrated killing them, and eventually eradicated them entirely. But here's the deeply ironic part. The dragon slayer mythology celebrates this as unambiguous good. The hero kills the dragon and everyone rejoices. The land is safe, the treasure is recovered, the monster is dead. But from an ecological perspective, from the perspective of biodiversity and the functioning of ecosystems, the extinction of apex predators is catastrophic. Those megafauna reptiles weren't just monsters, they were top predators playing crucial roles in their ecosystems. Their extinction would have had cascading effects, changes in prey populations, shifts in vegetation, alterations to entire ecological communities. We killed the dragons and celebrated, and the world became diminished in ways we didn't even have the framework to understand. The mythology preserves our triumph without acknowledging the cost, and perhaps that's fitting. Mythology never does show us the full picture. It shows us the story we want to tell ourselves, the version where humans are heroes, monsters are evil, and killing them is righteous. The reality, as always, is more complicated, more ambiguous, and considerably less flattering to us. The last dragon slayers weren't medieval knights or ancient heroes. They were colonial hunters in the 19th and early 20th centuries, shooting crocodiles for their hides, killing monitor lizards as pests, eliminating any large reptile that threatened livestock or could be profitably harvested. They didn't think of themselves as dragon slayers. They thought of themselves as practical men doing practical work. But functionally, they were finishing what their ancestors started, the systematic elimination of large, dangerous reptiles from human-dominated landscapes. And by the time we developed the ecological awareness to realize what we were losing, it was mostly too late. The dragons, in all their various real forms, were gone or pushed to the edges of viability. We won the war, and the victory was so complete that we forgot there was ever a war at all. We forgot that dragons were real. We relegated them to fantasy, and now we tell our children stories about mythical creatures that never existed, while the bones of the real dragons lie unexamined in museums, catalogued as Megalania, Quincana, Deinosuchus, scientific names for beasts that once were simply called dragons by the people who knew them, feared them, and ultimately destroyed them. So there it is, the real story behind dragons, not a fantasy conjured from nothing, not pure imagination spun into myth, but memory, distorted memory certainly, exaggerated through countless retellings, embellished with supernatural elements, blended with religious symbolism and cultural values, but memory nonetheless. Memory of bones too massive to comprehend, weathering from hillsides and riverbeds, demanding explanation from people who had no concept of deep time or extinction. Memory of living nightmares, apex predator reptiles that hunted in the same territories early humans desperately needed to survive in, creatures large enough and dangerous enough to justify genuine terror. Memory of encounters with the strange and the deadly, animals that could spray caustic chemicals, that inhabited volcanic regions, that seemed to glow in darkness, that hissed clouds of vapor that looked like smoke, and memory of the long, brutal campaign to eliminate these creatures, to make the world safe for human habitation by systematically hunting and killing anything large enough to threaten us. The consistency of dragon mythology across cultures isn't mysterious once you understand this. Of course, dragon legends appear worldwide, fossils appear worldwide, large dangerous reptiles appear worldwide, volcanic activity appears worldwide, the human response to existential threats appears worldwide. Different cultures encountered different specific creatures, found different specific fossils, told different specific stories, but the underlying pattern remained the same because the underlying reality remained the same. Big scary reptiles exist, or existed. Humans feared them, humans fought them, humans won. The mythology encodes this victory while simultaneously preserving the memory of what was lost, even if we didn't understand at the time that we were losing anything. What's fascinating is how close we came to forgetting entirely. By the medieval period in Europe, the actual animals that inspired dragon myths were mostly gone or drastically reduced. No one was encountering 20-foot monitor lizards or massive constrictors on a regular basis anymore. The fossils remained, continuing to fuel dragon beliefs, but the living encounters had largely ceased. dragons became entirely mythological, purely fantastical. The memory became divorced from reality. And if modern paleontology hadn't emerged in the 19th century to rediscover and reinterpret those bones, to understand extinction and deep time, we might never have made the connection. We might have continued forever believing dragons were pure invention, never realizing they were actually our ancestors' attempts to describe and explain genuine encounters with creatures that truly existed. There's something both sobering and oddly comforting about this realization. Sobering because it highlights how completely we've altered the world, how thoroughly we've eliminated the megafauna that once coexisted with us, how much biodiversity has been lost to human expansion and our intolerance for anything that threatens us. The dragons didn't disappear because they were mythical. They disappeared because we killed them. Every last one. We made the world safe, and in doing so made it smaller, less wondrous, less dangerous certainly, but also less rich, less varied, less full of the kind of magnificent terrors that force you to respect the natural world and your place within it. But it's also oddly comforting because it means our ancestors weren't foolish or primitive or superstitious for believing in dragons. They were observant, they were rational, they saw massive bones and concluded large creatures had existed. They encountered dangerous reptiles and concluded monsters needed to be feared and respected. They found valuable resources in dangerous places and concluded that risk could be worth reward if you were brave and clever enough. The mythology isn't evidence of ignorance, it's evidence of humans doing what humans do best, observing the world, trying to understand it, creating stories that encode that understanding and pass it on to future generations. The stories became fantastical, yes, but they started with observation and experience. They started with reality. So the next time you see a dragon in fiction, in a movie or a book or a piece of art, take a moment to remember what you're actually looking at. You're looking at humanity's memory of terror, stretched and twisted through millennia, but never entirely forgotten. You're looking at an echo of the Pleistocene, when the world was wilder and more dangerous and humans weren't yet the undisputed apex predators. You're looking at ancestral knowledge encoded in myth, warnings about large reptiles and dangerous places, celebrations of the heroes who made the world safer by eliminating those threats. You're looking at the ghosts of Megalania and Quincana and Deinosuchus and countless other massive reptiles whose bones still emerge from the earth to remind us they were real. You're looking at the fire that never really existed but represented something that did, the burning certainty that some creatures were dangerous beyond measure, that some threats required the full application of human courage and cunning to overcome. The dragons are gone now. We won. The world is safe, or at least safer from the specific threats that dragons represented. You can go to the river without worrying about crocodilians 30 feet long. You can explore caves without encountering monitor lizards the size of small cars. You can sleep at night without wondering if something massive and reptilian is tracking your scent through the darkness. That's progress, in a sense. That's the world our ancestors fought to create, a world where their children could live without that constant fear. But it's also loss of wildness, loss of the sublime terror that comes from knowing you're not the biggest, strongest, most dangerous thing in your environment, loss of the dragons in all their various real incarnations. So let that settle over you as you drift off tonight. The comfort of knowing the dragons are gone, that you're safe in your bed, that the monsters that haunted humanity's nightmares for tens of thousands of years have been eliminated, pushed to extinction, relegated to mythology and fantasy, but also the strange melancholy of knowing they were real once, that the world was big enough and wild enough to contain them, and that their loss, even if it made us safer, also made the world smaller and less wondrous. Let yourself imagine what it would have been like to live in that world, to be an early human, knowing that something massive and reptilian was out there in the darkness, watching, waiting, seeing you as prey, just as you saw it as a threat. And then let yourself be grateful you don't have to live in that world, that you inherited the safety your ancestors fought and died to create. The dragons were real. The dragons are gone. And somewhere in the space between those two truths lies the entirety of human history, our long, slow march from prey to predator, from victim to victor, from fearing the monsters to becoming the most successful monster of all. Sleep well with that knowledge, and know that whatever nightmares visit you tonight will only be dreams, echoes of ancient fears no longer grounded in reality, ghosts of dragons long since slain. The world outside is smaller now, safer now, more thoroughly dominated by humanity than those early storytellers could ever have imagined. The price was dragons, the reward was civilization, and the memory of what we lost is preserved in the stories we still tell, the myths we still cherish, the dragons we keep alive in imagination because we destroyed them so thoroughly in reality that imagination is all we have left. Rest easy, the dragons are gone. We made sure of that.